Hello, every folks, and good morning! Today I wanted to bend your ear about death and timers, specifically two mechanics that oftentimes kind of get demeaned, I guess you could say, in the kind of a greater sense of SRPGs and stuff like that. And so I wanted to kind of discuss their purpose for y'all here today. See, obviously, running a channel like this, I see a lot of new folks coming into the genre with a lot of very oddly specific, questions or issues or what have you. And the thing is, when I say a lot of folks, especially coming in and approaching, the classics or even some of the more well-known entries into the genre, oftentimes what I'll end up seeing is kind of a repeat of a couple of comments over and over of like, I would really love this thing right here, but I can't believe they would put in a mechanic like Permadeath or put in timers or whatever else. I just don't like that mechanic on principle. And the thing is, these games, they're not just farted out over a weekend. When it comes to SRPGs, they tend to be fairly complicated. They tend to be something that has been developed over a long period of time and very thoroughly thought out. It's part of the reason that we oftentimes don't get too many broken releases in terms of at least basic mechanics and functionality and stuff like that. They have a tendency to be pretty good in terms of realizing their mechanics before shipping, because that stuff tends to get figured out on the early end. So, with that being said, the reason that I'm bringing that up is because when it comes to permadeath and timers and things like that, it's more specifically permadeath, the thing is, it's often seen as a difficulty mechanic, a way to make everything more hardcore, a way to make it so that everything has more stakes, but in reality, it's more of a world-building feature. It's actually more of a role-playing type feature. And in fact, that's actually something that I covered a couple of videos ago here as well, which is the importance of a character's death. Oftentimes, when it comes to the roots of where a lot of this stuff ends up coming from back in the day, it has to be remembered that RPGs in general, they came from a tabletop setting. And oftentimes, when a character, somebody was done with a character or whatever else, what they would end up doing is essentially just killing them off in an interesting and memorable way, essentially concluding their story and moving on to another one. And it has to be seen from that particular lens. That when it comes to these games in general, remember that the RP part of any RPG, especially SRPGs here, stands for roleplay, meaning that essentially you're playing the role of that character. That character's life is not simply, they're not simply always the protagonist. They might in many ways just be a kind of another piece of the story, another thing that's there along the way for you to potentially experience this world and what have you. Just kind of another piece of the overall puzzle that's just kind of there to see everything explored, So to that end, I wanted to kind of go over how a few different games in the genre end up actually addressing this permadeath mechanic and explaining why exactly it is that it was there to begin with, because it's usually more of a narrative tool than it is a difficulty tool. And we'll actually go ahead and start off with one that we're not currently seeing on screen, but one that I just wanted to bring up right from the very start. And in fact, it's one that you generally will not hear coming up these days, and one that I really hope gets a remake at some point. That was Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. A funny little goober that was sort of I guess you could say, the GBA port of Final Fantasy Tactics that ended up doing a lot of things differently. It's the one that's oftentimes seen as the sort of kiddie entry due to the fact that there's generally a bit more kind of childish themes to it. However, the overall darker themes to that game are very heavily emphasized by the oftentimes forgotten permadeath system in that game. See, the thing is, for the most part, when you run into battles, your characters are simply knocked unconscious, and the reason for this, you're told very early on, is because the judges are there to protect them. The judges are the representatives of the law in that particular universe, and they are there to keep everybody safe. As long as the law is around, the law will keep you safe. And it's sort of there to give you that mentality of a child when, let's say, they're being raised in a sort of more middle-class type of setting there, where they're basically told, the law will always be there to keep you safe. And it's, depending on backgrounds and whatever else, you might have potentially heard different things from different situations, but that is one of those things that was very pervasive in the 90s, of just as long as if you need to be protected at any time, the law is always there. And so that's what ends up happening in that game. The only time that you actually run into the permadeath system is if you happen to go into one of the lawless areas, the Jags. And in those particular instances, if any character is dead at the end of the match, they're permanently dead. No extra, extra anything really, aside from, I believe, Montblanc actually gets a little bit of an extra scene if he dies, because he's been there with you from the very start of the game. But, like, it's meant to take you by surprise. It's meant to be this narrative moment. Like, no, you don't understand. The game didn't just do away with death. It's not a thing that doesn't exist in this universe, but the rules were very clearly established from the very start. Anyone can potentially die. Anyone can potentially be erased. This is just kind of where you're at right now, you know? This is just how everything consistently works. So that, from a narrative perspective, was pretty darn fun. And in fact, we actually see, when we take a look at stuff like Tactics Ogre, that's another one that's oftentimes kind of cited as like, oh, I can't believe they would put in permadeath, I lost my favorite unit or whatever else. But what has to be remembered is when it comes to Tactics Ogre, it's once again a type of a situation where the story is about sacrifice, about loss, about the fact that no individual person has enough power by themselves to fix a sort of generational conflict. The fact that no matter how hard they try, they will still always be at a disadvantage over the sort of established systems that are already there. The fact that a single unit dies, it's not something that's actually going to affect your strategy any, and I feel like that's oftentimes where players get a little bit stuck on that particular one, because they'll be like, oh, I lost XYZ important character, now the game's basically on permanent hard mode and it's incompletable and what have you. When oftentimes Tactics Ogre in general has been designed in such a way that a single character's loss is kind of inconsequential. That losing one particular unit just simply is a matter of replacing them with the next guy that comes along. Like back in the SNES version, we had a case where oftentimes the way that I actually played that one is just if any soldier was killed by an enemy soldier, immediately Denim goes up to that soldier, because he is the one guy that can recruit in that version, and basically says, hey, look, buddy, you're joining us now. You took something from us, your life is ours now. And that mentality was really fun from a roleplay perspective, because it essentially frames Denim, instead of being, this sort of a naive rebel leader of sorts, it frames him in a bit more of a, I guess, sort of a tit for tat, hostile, sort of a very aggressive type of leader there, wherein effectively he's subjugating people that have done him wrong in some way, and then just more or less glossing over it. It really changes the sort of mood in the room, so to speak. So that by the time that you get to the very end of the game, when they're going and justifying all the various atrocities they've committed over the course of it, it carries a very different tone when you look at your party, and all of the original people that came with you are long dead, replaced with the characters that ended up killing them along the way. Those guys ended up getting eaten by a random dragon or something, shot off a cliff or whatever else, and immediately just get replaced by the skeleton that shield bashed them to death. It leads to this very, like, you showed up with the army you have, not the army that you wanted type of feeling. But they actually ended up readjusting this over the course of the series, where, let's say, something like Tactics Ogre Reborn, they actually put much more emphasis on the sort of mourning phase of losing a character. Where, honestly, the skill difference between many characters outside of unique ones, and even those unique ones, like, they might have unique skills, but you can just go back in New Game Plus and just get new ones. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal. And losing those skills is not going to put you in any permanent hard mode. I mean, I've shown several times that in Reborn you can basically take out-of-the-shop generics, bring them over to the very hardest part of the post-game and still do just fine. But the thing is, though, that it puts more emphasis on the mourning phase. When a character dies, their items all drop to the floor. They become a physical part of the stage, essentially reminding you every time somebody steps on that tile, like, you messed up. You let this character die. You let them down. Their death is almost entirely on your hands. You let them bleed out, you let them get knocked off a cliff or whatever else. If they're knocked off a cliff, that sense of loss is further kind of compounded in a mechanical sense, because their items are now destroyed because that person was lost in their entirety. Again, just adding more kind of weight to that particular situation. It's one of the few ways that the game actually can directly hurt you in a more long-term sense when you end up losing their equipment. And it always gives you the option to avoid this. It's not difficult to avoid even, considering that in most situations you'll, for example, be running things like Steadfast or whatnot. So you always have the means to go and avoid it, but the fact that it always drops those items on the field, even if it's just generic items that don't necessarily help you that much, it always just reinforces that same reminder, that same feeling of a character, being lost. And again, it's like you just pick up their loot pile again as, some enemy unit runs off with their stuff, and now on top of having lost that character, on top of potentially losing those items, you get the further insult of they've been looted, their death has been desecrated. Again, adding more to that sort of like roleplay potential of that potential mechanic there, It's very, very cool in my eyes. So I really appreciate that from that standpoint. And we actually saw something very similar come out of XCOM 2 as well, where if a character ended up dying, if you didn't bring their body out of the stage with you, you ended up losing those items, or if, you secured the area or what have you. But again, there was this emphasis on making sure that that sort of the death of the character was respected, that it was something that was tangibly right there. It was something that reinforced this idea that the character died. You might mechanically care more about the items that the person was carrying rather than, the character themselves, but it still reinforced that idea of that character's death. And in fact, we actually saw a sort of opposite approach from stuff like Final Fantasy Tactics, as well as the Tactics Ogre PSP version, where there was more of a focus on legacy and permanent loss, which in Final Fantasy Tactics case, it's, I would argue, one of the less useful cases of a permadeath system, but I get where they were coming from with that one. Because they wanted to give you this lonely feeling that your party was entirely on its own against the elements, against all the powers that be in the world, against all of these various corrupted factions and what have you. You were on your own. Nobody was coming in to save you. You weren't securing the area when you were done. You were escaping with your lives. And so they added this countdown mechanic where at the end of that character's countdown, they just permanently died, and that was it. And if I recall correctly, they potentially took their items with them. Now, I don't recall that correctly because, like everybody else, honestly, when it came to the permadeath system, it's something that never really came up because usually you would just go revive them, or oftentimes if you were getting to the point of having permadeath, you usually ended up already losing the fight handily enough that you probably were not ending it anyway. So I don't feel like it was a particularly good implementation of it, but the idea of having this sort of hostile feeling to the world where, nobody's coming to save you, you're not getting somebody to a hospital or whatever else in time, it does have a sort of cool connotation to it. Like, for example, in Tactics Ogre, if a character is downed or whatever else, oftentimes there's this rush to end the fight so that your presumed support elements can come in from the background and get everybody up to scratch. And that's pretty darn cool. Now, with that said, we actually saw what I'm kind of referring to here as a sort of a legacy approach there. Because if that character died, if one of your other characters was there in their final moments, collecting their crystal, as it were, they ended up learning all of the skills that character had, which, again, in premise, is pretty cool. Like, I love that as a sort of a narrative device. I don't think it was handled particularly well because the whole crystal thing, it does obviously have some drawbacks in terms of you actually, have to be there at that time, and enemy unit can come up and steal it. I feel like if you didn't have the option to actually heal yourself in those situations, it might work a bit better. Seeing as the way the mechanic worked, you more or less had the option of, like, would you prefer to heal your unit fully, or would you like to learn all of their skills? And the AI always took a look at that and was like, free HP, you say? And it had a 10c2 backfire. So I feel like if it was only available to the player and it was just like the old characters just sitting there dying, and then their ally comes up and they're like, oh, quick, here's my favorite drink recipe. I don't know if anyone will get the reference, but either way, it would have been, I feel like it would have worked a bit better. But what we actually saw was a sort of attempt to fix that system in the in Tactics Ogre PSP, wherein your dead character actually showed up as essentially a dying body in your party inventory, and then you just directly chose who to transfer that stuff into, which again, it's cool. It's neat that that they added the little further mechanical flair that you, let's say, that you end up giving that particular character a sort of burial of sorts, having to pay some silver coins to have them buried and stuff. That's cool. I feel like they needed to make more of a ritual out of it, like the way that they handle the item drops in its remake in the form of Reborn. I feel like it probably did it quite a decent bit better. The idea was interesting. Again, trying to do that whole, like, in their final moments, they carried along all of the lessons of the past and whatnot. It had potential, okay? It had ideas. I just feel like it probably could have been implemented a decent bit better there. In the future, I'm hoping that the Final Fantasy Tactics remake does finally realize the potential of that sort of, last dying breaths type of idea. And actually, speaking of characters dying in fairly popular SRPGs, let's now move along to XCOM. And actually, both versions of XCOM, again, oftentimes are held up as examples like, oh, it's total bullshit, my character died and now my run's incompletable. But, hear me out. This is actually entirely intentional with the themes of both those games. Not in terms of being difficult, but for actually two different directions. Hold on, one quick sip of coffee. Decently generic coffee today. Anyway, so the thing with XCOM is that it's not a matter of just your soldiers reaching the finish line. Yes, that does help. Their experience certainly does help smoothen out the experience, and a lot of players will just basically save and load every time they lose their favorite units to try and make the experience as smooth as possible. But the mechanical meat of XCOM in its newer versions, and hell, even its original versions, all actually circles around that cycle of death. You see, XCOM is not a matter of winning battles, it's a matter of creating a resilient system. In fact, it has some very uncomfortable real-world analogs with what we see kind of overseas. I mean, I'm in the U.S., so, overseas for me here. But in the certain, Europe situation with a certain hundreds-year-long, dumpster fire that is currently trying to take on the world's breadbasket. Anyway, so we actually see a very similar mentality there between the factions that end up coming up in XCOM. Wherein, if they tried to rely on the experience of the individual soldier to survive, they would never end up getting anywhere. In the classic XCOMs, those soldiers could just randomly get hit by some random thing out of the blue. They have the best armor in the game, and then just all of a sudden, just a random shot gets a lucky crit, and they're gone. All of that experience is gone. The morale of the entire party ends up dropping to nothing, and you have a bunch of rookies panic firing rocket launchers at each other in point-blank range. You have XCOM Enemy Unknown, in which it seems like that's the way to get ahead. You win fights, you get experience, and your soldiers end up getting better, and they get all these super overpowered abilities. But that's the thing. It's essentially sacrificing flesh for machine as you end up carrying along. And those original ones, learning to utilize things like tanks for scouting, using flight for scouting, and whatever else. Finding these different means of essentially keeping your soldiers safe by never forcing them to engage in the first place, replacing the initial kind of rush of soldiers that you had out in the field with the sort of business economy, as it were, where oftentimes experienced players would just end up going and building various different businesses out of their bases, manufacturing arms for the entire world in order to basically go and sort of pay their way to victory. They don't have to worry about the loss of the individual unit because they can just keep replacing them more and more and more and more and more and more. They keep getting better and better kind of equipment over time, essentially using money as their sort of vehicle for getting ahead. And in XCOM Enemy Unknown, those deaths, while they were framed for the purpose of the sort of like horror narrative to the whole thing, what it does give you is, again, that same feeling where early on it feels like you should be focusing on things like your unit's experience and things like that, only to then realize, hold on, I don't really need particularly experienced units when I can simply send in the laser rifles. Once we end up rushing laser rifles, once we end up getting some of these initial upgrades, we can actually absolutely, kind of do some wonders here in terms of our offense. A basic rookie with a scope and laser rifle can now suddenly just kind of come in out of the blue and start kicking ass. They're taking out chrysalids, they're dealing with mutons, they have all of these different options for fighting different enemies. And so this is very, very effective. This is suddenly taking that lowest common denominator and raising it up just that little bit, giving them that better armor, those laser rifles, that equipment that you end up keeping even if they end up dying, because those are now kind of your checkpoints, as it were. Your experienced soldiers may be lost, and they may be difficult to replace, but your robots, your fancier guns and things like that, that stuff is easy to replace. That stuff is something that will immediately be back in your inventory if something ends up happening. Again, you're sort of building resilience into your system because that initial meat cannot survive, but the machine can. And what we see in XCOM 2 is a similar sort of mental approach where essentially you will definitely lose people more often in that one. But what we see in the chaos of it all is that focus on relationships and, again, building out your sort of resistance network, as it were. You may lose those individual units, but then you get bonuses where, for example, the resistance is sending in additional kind of generic soldiers to help you out here and there. You're seeing more assistance pop up. You're seeing more opportunities to exploit out in the field. You're seeing more units come in as replacements from your various kind of spy activities and what have you. All of your covert actions are giving you more assistance. You have cards that potentially are reducing the cost of your recruits. Maybe they're improving the levels of your recruits as you end up getting them. Again, you're building up your system. You're not necessarily focusing on just those individual units, but you're building up the system. And the system, the logistics of it all, that's what the focus of XCOM is. It's not the survival of the individual soldier, it's the system, it's the organization. That's why it's the name of the game, you know? And I feel like that's oftentimes missed, and without that permadeath, if just going in and saving and reloading with every death, you miss that sort of mechanical depth to it all. You miss the sort of a core tenet of what the game is. That again, it's not just the individual character surviving, that it's the organization learning to adapt and thrive and stuff like that. And in fact, we see something very similar from stuff like Battle Brothers, one that's oftentimes held up as being brutally unfair in terms of its difficulty. One where you can walk into your very first fight of a run, lose absolutely everybody, and then be expected to march on just fine. And again, mentality-wise, that is an absolutely perfect fit, because it's that mercenary mentality. It's trying to put you into that mindset of mercenaries back in the day, where realistically you can't trust anyone. Even the best of the best might get completely screwed over because somebody just ended up reading something wrong. Like, if you think that's unrealistic, look up the story of the Genoese crossbows at the battle at Agincourt there. Essentially being a situation where you had some of the most elite mercenaries in the world at the time, essentially crossbowmen that were known for their kind of interesting shield and crossbow tactics, who ended up being forced to fight in the rain due to a mistake that was made by the French, I believe it was. I'm going to immediately end up getting some of that wrong, but they ended up being forced to fight in a situation where their crossbows didn't work. They tried to reposition so that they could essentially use their swords instead, and their own allies turned against them, assuming that they were retreating, meaning that essentially they were killed in a very, very stupid and random way, but again, such was the life of mercenaries back in the day. But yeah, that's the thing. Misunderstandings, kind of outright chaos, a sort of need to sort of basically not trust anyone was part of that mercenary mindset. And that's the sort of mindset that it takes to actually get somewhere in that game. And lastly, to avoid this going on too long, I want to actually talk about what I consider to be the finest example of understanding how to use permadeath that there ever was. Okay? Just one that manages to encompass everything that's good about those types of mechanics. And I will mention, I talked about timers earlier. Specifically, the reason I was actually going to bring that up is going to be the best example of timers I've ever seen. I was going to go on about, XCOM 2's timers a little bit, but realistically speaking, you get that general idea. It just sort of ratchets up the tension in that situation. But when it comes to Unicorn Overlord, the way that it basically sets it up so that you have functionally immortal units, but you do have this situation where essentially time is your main resource, where you have a certain amount of time to complete every single stage. Your characters, when they die, they can simply hop into a town and essentially regenerate themselves, but your time is limited, so your ability to... it's kind of this weird pseudo-state of not quite permadeath, but effectively it may be permadeath depending on the situation, where a character may not die for narrative purposes, but if they're killed off early in a fight, will they actually have enough time to recover? Can you spare enough time to recover? Can you find the means to get them back up on their feet before the fight ends? How do you use somebody else to buy more time to utilize that timer to then bring your aces back? How do you, let's say, maybe spend some of your kind of valor points and things like that to, let's say, use a soldier to go bring up multiple different parties at the same time, so that maybe they can use their recovery abilities to just barely squeak by, just get that little bit of extra energy out of your party. Man, it's such a perfect blend of timers and pseudo permadeath mechanics that aren't really permadeath mechanics, that just like, it's just a thing of beauty. Okay, honestly, Unicorn Overlord is some of the most genius game design I've seen in a while. Anyway though, I want to talk about Ogre Battle 64 next, so let's hop into that real quick. Righty, so welcome to Ogre Battle 64. Now this is, in my opinion, the most jaw-droppingly beautiful approach to death mechanics that I have ever seen in anything, just because of the sheer variety of different ways that it manages to utilize the systems to their maximum potential. And this is something that I really, really wish more games would actually take note of, because it's essentially a situation where everybody's kind of approach to permadeath is a little bit different. It's a little bit of everything of the above. This is one of the bigger inspirations for how we got Unicorn Overlord recently. But take a look at this here, okay? So, in the case of permadeath, the way that it works is as follows. And when it comes to your soldiers, any one of them can potentially be killed at any time, and they essentially show up grayed out in the party menu. If you leave them for long enough, essentially over time there is a set percentage kind of chance that they will end up zombifying, effectively taking this previously useful person and turning them into an absolute husk of a human being. And immediately we start getting a little bit of that sort of mourning phase, as I was calling it. It's approached in a lot of different ways in a lot of different games, you know, from XCOM giving you your sort of death wall as it's there, you know, XCOM 2 giving you your memorial pictures. You know, stuff like Tactics Ogre giving you that item bag that repeatedly reminds you of what you did. As well as adapting its story to any time that a plot character dies. But what we have in Ogre Battle 64, we have the thing where plot characters can actually die, that they will just basically stop appearing in cutscenes if they end up zombifying. But additionally, you have them around as this shambling husk, a reminder that you let them down, and this is all that's left of them. Because in this universe, it's basically like kind of like Walking Dead in many ways, where once a character is dead, they will just basically come back as the undead until something exercises them, and that's effectively how it works here. Next time this party runs into a cleric, they will probably end up targeting this guy, exercising him instead, and that's just the end of that. Then that guy is just permanently gone, this party slot is filled up, or is left empty, but this kind of awkward phase where you're reminded of the living dead corpse of your party just sort of being around, you know, that they ended up zombifying. This sort of situational approach where these named soldiers can be zombified, but these other soldiers over here, these generic nobody soldiers, they will instantly die if their health drops low enough. Each of them has, I believe, 32 health, and if they end up getting knocked out, that's just it. They're dead. You get another one from your soldier pile. You can have up to a reserve of 97 of them, and every time that one of them dies, just you replace them with another one. You basically heal them by replacing them. And this is further leaned into in other ways, because as I mentioned, plot characters can also die. If your leader dies, that's just an obvious game over, but any, like, let's say named characters that die, they just simply won't show up in cutscenes anymore. They just won't be there. Others will potentially take their place, other situations may potentially happen, but they're just not there to experience their own stories anymore. But in the case of these soldiers, like, these soldiers are further kind of approaching the death mechanic in the opposite direction, wherein if these soldiers experience enough victories, they end up promoting. Now, the more soldiers you have in a party, the more of a chance, the more experience they gain, because essentially it's like a whole camaraderie thing. But the more experience they gain, the more quickly they will get promoted into one of these guys here, into a generic Amazon or soldier. At which point now they're not subject to that immediate permadeath anymore and can now be revived. At which point they potentially end up getting promoted into other classes over time as you end up getting into new areas of the game. You unlock new towns, you have access to new shops, new equipment, which allows you to access new classes, which means that as you get these new kind of uniforms for these different classes, you're then able to then transform these units into upgraded versions. but they're still subject to that same death mechanic. At any time, they can get potentially killed, and if a leader of a party is killed, while they can potentially be revived, unless that party makes it back to base and you drag them over to go manually revive them somehow, or you have an item that's already in your inventory to revive them, potentially they're in a state that you might lose that leader character forever. The rest of the squad meanders around leaderless, attempting to retreat, potentially getting attacked from the rear repeatedly, getting harassed on their way back home, potentially wiping out everyone that's there. In fact, actually, I mentioned Unicorn Overlord earlier. They have a mechanic specifically referencing this in the New Game Plus version, wherein if a character dies, they'll still return at the end of the fight. But if a leader, if the entire squad ends up getting eliminated, that everyone in that squad is fully eliminated unless you use a very limited resource to actually bring them back in True Zenoiran mode. But again, the way that this approach essentially views all these characters in a different way is fascinating. You're bringing along these generic soldiers in order to promote them through the ranks to become real people. You have a full history with these people where they progress through these different classes. They essentially acquire and whatever else, depending on their alignment, their history, who they are as a person, all that kind of thing. It leads to a very personal experience with every one of these units. So in a lot of the more chaotic fights, where somebody is potentially instantly killed seemingly out of nowhere, they're ambushed by a cockatrice, they're petrified, and they suffocate to death. Now all of a sudden the entire battle has to stop for a moment. You have to stop, reconsolidate your territory, claim the town that potentially has a witch's hut in it to go bring it back, or potentially just risk losing them forever. And that moment of tension would not be possible without a permadeath mechanic. It's this thing where they're basically taking everything in a way that you won't mechanically suffer that much from losing one individual unit. But emotionally, you feel the struggle of these units so much. On paper, technically your money's limited, your amount of replacement soldiers is limited, but if you get to the point of ever running out of each of those, you have far bigger problems, and realistically you probably have other ways to win the map anyway. But emotionally, that sort of invested feeling of knowing that you brought this random soldier up from being absolutely nobody. You see them promote out of their little group of little goblin people into a real person. You see them stand up and physically get taller from their group, equip their new gear, and suddenly join the rest of the team, leaving the rest of their soldiers behind. It's such a beautiful growth moment, And again, seeing them grow from these basic classes into more advanced classes, essentially seeing both your territory as well as your progress in the game transform so beautifully into something that explores both the permadeath mechanics as well as the growth mechanics in this thing. It is the finest example I have ever seen of a game understanding how to make full use of this permadeath system, and I haven't even gotten into the transformations. Which, by the way, if you notice some visual jank in this whole thing, note that this is currently being emulated off of a PlayStation Vita, so it was never meant to handle this in the first place, but it is the most convenient way to play it, in my opinion. Anyway, so one more thing I want to mention is the transformations, because those exist too. Like, let's say you have a character that is particularly divine, right? That they have somebody that was a particularly good character. They're very lawfully aligned. They're very kind of religious, as it were. And there is a chance when they're killed that they end up coming back as an angel, if you have the right equipment available for them to do so. If you have the right kind of stuff discovered along the way, they might be able to promote into a lot of different unique classes. Whether it's a wizard being killed in a particular way to come back as an undead lich, whether it's again a healer coming back as an angel. There's little transformations that can happen. Things like, for example, I think, I forget exactly how this works, but it was something like if both lightning and fire magic end up combining in the middle of an attack to kill a golem that's made of clay, that it ends up smelting them into steel. Like, that's just so fucking cool. Or like a mummy gets potentially gets all their stuff burned off and they come back as a skeleton. Like, that is just the coolest damn thing. Ogre Battle 64 may be kind of janky in a lot of ways, but damn does this game do a lot of cool stuff with its permadeath systems. Again, stuff that would have absolutely no weight if it wasn't there. So again, when thinking about permadeath, thinking about timers, thinking about all these other things, remember that the developers are trying to talk to you. They're trying to put you into the mindset, into the roleplay mindset of their game, this world they imagined, these characters that they imagined. They're trying to put you in that world to make you feel your place in it. They're not trying to just make it hard for the purpose of being hard. Even back when games claimed that they were doing that, honestly, a lot of times that's just marketing gimmicks, because people love a good challenge, okay? So again, remember to roleplay. Remember the importance of using all the letters of your SRPG, because you know what? It's important to roleplay in your role-playing game. All right, it doesn't sound like something that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like one of those things that would be like, oh, you know, I'm just gonna go roleplay as a freaking wizard or whatever this time around. Like, no, it's just imagine your place in this world. Imagine what you would potentially care about. Imagine what your people would potentially care about. Like, what is their place here? What is their goal? Like, what are they trying to achieve? What are their ambitions? And it makes a lot more sense. And oftentimes it'll give you so much more value out of these experiences. You know, it'll have a tendency to give you a lot more replayability as well. Oftentimes, that's part of the reason that we see people going and replaying the same games, you know, potentially 100 times with different parties. It's not just experiencing those different party mechanics, but experiencing the kind of roleplay potential, like, you know, going through Final Fantasy Tactics with just squires. That idea of embracing the physicality of the world, you know, like just what a stone throw can do in terms of pushing somebody backwards, what the tactical ramifications are of essentially just hitting somebody with a counter tackle. You know, maybe that changes your positioning entirely. Maybe that gives you a different mentality of keeping all of your people together and sort of feeling them together as a group, having them rely on each other, trusting each other, all that kind of thing. It gives you more of a feeling of camaraderie. Playing games suboptimally for the purpose of role-playing is just a magical experience that I would recommend to, frankly, anybody. Also, I still don't know what on earth this weird spinning glitch is with this emulator, but hey, whatever, it's funny, and it is what it is. Alright, so I gotta get going. Y'all have yourselves a good one. I hope this was at least interesting, and yeah, I will see you in the next one. Right, y'all take care. Thanks for stopping by. Man, I was going to go on this whole rant over how the lack of permadeath basically just, like, how even in the story, absolutely just kind of threw the narrative of triangle strategy entirely on its face. But, oh well, whatever. We'll rant about triangle strategy as is tradition another day. Y'all have yourselves a good one. Take care. Bye.